Hello, and welcome to this 41st episode in my series titled Questioning Woke Psychotherapy. My name is Michael Dwan Herrick. I'm a psychotherapist and a life coach with over 40 years of experience, and I'm currently in private practice in London. I've also taught a course on diversity for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, to trainees working toward their qualification in psychotherapy. In this video, I'll address the concept of privilege as it applies to critical social justice, also known as woke. We're all familiar with this term as it has been widely used to label those who belong to certain identity groups deemed to have unearned advantages over other groups and therefore oppressive power. The groups most commonly identified as privileged are white people and men. Also included, but not as pervasively, are heterosexuals and able-bodied people. The popular understanding is that if you belong to one of these groups, then your life can be generally characterized as privileged. If you don't belong to one of these groups, then your life can be characterized as disadvantaged. The former constitutes an oppressive class of people, whether they know or intend it or not, and the latter are an oppressed class, again, whether they know it or not. Most of us have already done some thinking about all of this. Since you're watching this video, you may have considered some flaws in this way of categorizing people. I hope to provide some further ways for you to think about this, ways that you may not have yet considered. I want to be very clear about something right here at the beginning. In what follows, I will not be asserting that privilege and disadvantage do not exist, or that they can't be statistically correlated with certain groups. I will be saying that it's complicated, particularly at the level of the individual. There are always both privileges and disadvantages. When any group or individual is unduly privileged or disadvantaged, that's worthy of our attention and response. We should continually seek to address the rights and needs of all people as best we can. So there's a baby in the bathwater of the idea of privilege, but I'll be talking mostly about the bathwater. My first point is that applying the label of privilege to individuals based on a single identity category is a crude characterization that has very limited utility toward understanding that person. Taking an intersectional approach, first proposed by Kimberly Crenshaw, and considering a few categories as it has been practiced, is also limited. If an intersectional approach was taken to its logical conclusion and all circumstances that confer either privilege or disadvantage were considered, we'd have a much finer grained understanding of individuals. However, it's rarely, if ever, taken that far. Typically, only a few intersections are focused on. I'll say more about this later. Also, even when we include multiple categories of identity or circumstance, we need to account for an individual's actual experiences in life. We should not simply assume that those experiences must have been thus and so based on the category we have assigned them to. Shortcuts on the road to understanding a person, taken via crude characterizations and the assumptions that are derived from them, lead to an incomplete and grossly distorted understanding of people. I would add that this applies also to hasty mental health and psychiatric diagnoses. So let's dive into white privilege. I think most of us are aware of Peggy McIntosh's 1988 essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. McIntosh herself grew up in an affluent suburb of New Jersey and attended Radcliffe, UCLA, or UCL, and Harvard, where she earned a PhD. She therefore ought to know about privilege. As McIntosh does not present any empirical evidence to substantiate any of her claims about what is in this invisible backpack, one is left to assume that the items in her knapsack are a collection of conclusions she has reached based on her own anecdotal experience as a privileged white person. If she could provide empirical evidence for these things, for them being true for all or even most of white people, or pose them as hypotheses to be verified by research, that would be an essay worthy of a Harvard graduate. One might discover that these knapsack items are not all present and significant for all white people. We might also discover that not all Black people or non-white people are deprived of these things. We might then have a better understanding of where and why and for whom and to what degree these things are actually true and significant. The other thing I notice about the items in Macintosh's knapsack is that many are more in the category of basic human rights, not privileges. Just one example, number 25. Quote, if a traffic cop pulls me over or if the IRS audits my tax return, I can be sure I haven't been singled out because of my race, end quote. Clearly, when such a thing happens, it's wrong and should be rectified. The remedy is to restore equal treatment, not take away something that hasn't been earned. Rights and privileges are not the same thing. And then there are some peculiar items, like number 17, quote, I can talk with my mouth full and not have people put this down to my color, unquote. I don't know. I can easily imagine such behavior being attributed to the ill manners of working class, quote, white trash. It would be fun and interesting to unpack every item in Macintosh's knapsack and reflect on the potential validity and utility of each one, but I don't have time for it here. I'll invite you to check it out and see what you think is true and useful in the list and what might not be. Okay, let's move on to male privilege. Do men have some privileges and advantages? Well, sure, many men do. But that's not the whole story. I don't want to get bogged down here, so I'll simply point out some facts and invite you to reflect on the blanket assumption that all men are privileged. Consider, men have a shorter lifespan expectancy than women by roughly 7 years. 70% of homeless people are men. Men successfully commit suicide 4 times more often than women. Workplace deaths occur 23 times more for men, or 95% more compared to women. Statistics vary, but generally men receive significantly longer prison sentences for the same crimes as women. Crimes against women are more severely punished than crimes against men. Circumcision is legal while female genital mutilation is not. There is unequal treatment of men in family and divorce courts. Men have traditionally been expected to provide for and protect women and children. This includes providing an expensive engagement ring before marrying and being last to get into lifeboats. How can all of these things be true if all men are hands down privileged? While there are a small number of elite men at the top of the economic ladder, most men are not occupying those lofty heights. I want to move on and recognize other forms of privilege and disadvantage that are not typically given as much attention. These are the kinds of things that we could include in an expanded intersectional approach. Including these kinds of things gives us a more accurate, while also more complicated picture of privilege and disadvantage as applies to individuals. Class. In this context, I'm referring to economic advantage or disadvantage and access to economic opportunities. While this is technically included in an intersectional hierarchy, it is often neglected in terms of its true significance. Particularly as the emphasis is on race and gender, the problems of the white working class poor are often overlooked. If anything, they are lumped into the category of privileged and deemed racist to boot, due to being white. Their plight is an inconvenient reality that doesn't bolster the notion of ubiquitous white privilege. Physical attractiveness. This includes the subcategories of facial disfigurement, obesity, alopecia, unsightly moles and birthmarks, and vitiligo. Advantages of physical attractiveness include being perceived more positively in social interactions, more likely to be hired and promoted in jobs, easier time forming and maintaining romantic relationships, perceived as more competent, to name a few. Being unattractive means these advantages are not as readily available. Two-parent households. Growing up in a two-parent household with a mother and father, it turns out that this is generally an advantage, not for every household, but statistically for most. For instance, the National Fatherhood Initiative says kids without a father at home are more likely to have behavioral problems, go to prison, commit a crime, be 279% more likely to carry guns and deal drugs, 2 times more likely to drop out of school. There's a long list of these things. Some of the pushback against the argument for a two-parent household is the objection that all family configurations should be respected and valued, not just the traditional model. I think this is an important objection. Not all traditional families are bastions of mental health, and not all single-parent households fail to meet the developmental needs of children. But facts are facts and shouldn't be ignored. Nurturing parenting. Whatever family structure one grows up in, stable nurturing parenting is an advantage. If a parent or parents are good enough, per the theory of British pediatrician and psychoanalyst Winnicott, then one stands a better chance of developing into adulthood in a healthy way. That means being better able to regulate one's emotions, form stable and loving relationships, be resilient in the face of adversity, and find a balance between self-discipline and self-care. On the other hand, all these things are likely to be compromised if one experiences inadequate or abusive parenting, including addicted parents or severely mentally ill parents. Moving on. Chronic illness and pain. Depending on the illness and its severity, this can be a significant disadvantage in all areas of one's life. That means work, leisure, relationships, and physical functioning. To not have a chronic illness is an advantage that most take for granted. The same can be said for chronic pain. While it might not be due to an illness, it can compromise one's life in all the same ways, and it is likely to be invisible to others. Disabilities. This includes physical, sensory, and psychological. There's too many ways that disabilities can manifest for me to list them. Some have a profound impact on the quality of one's life, and some less. There are those that compromise the body, others that compromise the mind, and those that compromise one's sight and hearing. Level of intelligence, or IQ. Although not completely, IQ is largely determined by genetics and confers many advantages, such as academic success, problem solving, career success, increased longevity, and greater earning capacity and financial stability. These advantages are not as available for those with low IQs. Related to intelligence, we could consider innate talents. For instance, musical, athletic, mathematical, and linguistic. These might be considered different forms of intelligence, but those with more innate talent in one or more of these areas are more likely to succeed in their endeavors in those areas. Conversely, those not so innately endowed will be less likely to succeed. Personality profile. Personality, like most things, is a product of the combination of nature and nurture, neither one of which are we able to choose when we're born. Some personality profiles are more likely than others to be valued and accepted socially. One example is that generally those with an extroverted personality are more valued, while introversion is often seen as a social disadvantage. This is an incomplete list, and it's only been superficially explored. Each one matters and can be an example of either privilege or disadvantage. Some of these may matter more than race or gender. My point is that all of these things and many more converge in unique combinations for each individual. Also, each will be true on a scale of significance for each person. The significance of each, when present, cannot be assumed, but will have to be understood differently for each person depending on many factors, including what else is also true for that person. Thinking that we can categorize someone as either privileged or disadvantaged based on a caricature of one or even a few identity categories or circumstances is frankly preposterous. Before moving on, I want to share just a few of the examples of diversity that students talked about when giving seminar presentations in the diversity class that I taught. These things were personally relevant for each student and represent what can be either a privilege or a disadvantage. In other words, if it's not true for you, then you're privileged to not have to contend with it. While these things may be painful in themselves, that pain is often exacerbated by a social stigma about them. These things include the following. This is what the students talked about. Childlessness, whether voluntary or involuntary. Menopause. Height, variable for men and women, in that short men and tall women may be socially disadvantaged. Age and ageism. Biracial identity. Dyspraxia. For all of these items on an expanded intersectionality inventory, each one will be variably significant depending on changing contexts. In some places, sometimes, and with some people, they will be more impactful, and in other places, with other people, at other times, they'll be less so. Therefore, we need to know a person's predominant context and other mediating contexts before we can proclaim that they are generally privileged or disadvantaged, and to what degree. Some disadvantages, whether hypothetical or real, will be variably mitigated by other privileges. Some privileges will be eclipsed to varying degrees by other disadvantages. When a therapist derives an understanding of a client based on a dichotomous choice of either privilege or disadvantage, and they rely on a host of assumptions about what either one means, they create a crude caricature of the client. This caricature then becomes an avatar that can be taken to represent a group, whether black, white, female, male, homosexual, heterosexual, trans, cis. This caricature is useful to the therapist who assumes the role of social activist as a central part of the therapeutic endeavor. It helps to inform a therapist about whether they should evoke a sense of grievance and resentment in their clients or, conversely, guilt and shame. If the client can be indoctrinated into the correct view of their situation and the corresponding emotions are activated, then the therapist can believe and feel that something will have been done toward making the world a better place. What it will not do is bring the therapist to a full and clear understanding of each unique individual client and all their complexity and nuance. In its ambition to fix the world, it will not put the therapist in the best place to serve the client's needs, which should be the central purpose of therapy. Still, we could ask a few more questions. Where privilege has been accurately identified, what is the most useful way to a person to regard their privilege? Should it evoke a feeling of guilt and shame, leading to contrition and the willingness to relinquish their privilege? Is that what therapists should try to instill in their white male clients, for instance? I think it depends on how the client got their privilege and what they are doing with it. If it has been acquired and exercised without regard for negative consequences caused to others, then probably guilt and atonement are appropriate. A therapist might attempt to explore this with a client, but not see it as an opportunity to indoctrinate them with a moral and political ideology. Exploration and indoctrination are two very different things. If privilege was acquired by the luck of birth and circumstances, I see no usefulness for guilt or shame or the relinquishment of privilege. Instead, what seems more appropriate and useful to me is a sense of gratitude and an aspiration to do something useful with that privilege, something that will be of benefit to others, particularly those less fortunate. While that's my view, I don't think that it's my job as a therapist to indoctrinate clients with this idea. It could be something to explore, but I believe everyone has to work this out for themselves. Not many clients come to therapy because they are thrilled with how great their lives are going due to all their unearned privilege. The problem of how to pass on their good luck to others is not usually their reason for paying for talking to someone. And where disadvantage has been accurately identified, what is the most useful way for a person to regard their disadvantage? Should it evoke a feeling of resentment and solidify one's identity as a victim? Should it evoke shame? Is that what therapists should foster in their clients, even if unintentionally? I don't think so. I think it's useful to recognize and acknowledge disadvantages and the social conditions that provoke even more unnecessary suffering. There's a place for advocacy and even activism for some in these circumstances, and a therapist can play a supportive role in this at times. A supportive role is not the same as being a recruiter for social activist causes. But even in situations where supporting social activism is appropriate, I think that the therapist ought to also and primarily help a client to recognize whatever privileges and advantages they have. As well, a therapist can support their clients who are disadvantaged to clarify their life goals and marshal their strengths and resources toward pursuing these goals. This doesn't have to ignore the unfairness of nature or society, but it allows for hope and a path forward that doesn't get stuck in a cul-de-sac of resentment or a sinkhole of victimhood. Well, I think that's enough for now. If you like this video, please give it a like, subscribe to my channel, click the bell for notifications, leave a comment, and share it with a friend. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other. Appreciate, enjoy, and do something good with your privileges. Bye for now.